All right. Welcome to our live session on slavery and labor. We are finally gotten past the year 1700 in our class this week. It's not a cookie. Go lay down. Sorry. All right. The dog still wants the cookies. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about slavery in more detail for our class this week, because slavery is going to be more and more common in the United States after the year 1700 for a variety of reasons, which we'll go over today. And also because slavery as an institution is really important to understanding our early history as a nation. Raise your hand if you've heard of, or even if you don't know what it is, if you've at least heard of the 1619 Project. Anybody? Anybody seen it mentioned in the news?
No, ma'am.
No? Okay. So the 1619 Project was a project done by a number of historians and the New York Times. And the goal of the project was to ask the question, how has slavery impacted U.S. history? And to look at this notion that slavery is very tied to how the United States developed, and you can't separate U.S. history out from slavery. And this actually provoked a response by former President Trump to say that that was too negative, and he proposed his own historical commission, the 1776 Project, which published its first and only report, because it was disbanded by President Biden, back in January. So last month on MLK Day, they dropped their report. And they made the argument that they felt that focusing on slavery too much was negative to American history. So we're going to talk about today, though, you can't get away from talking about slavery in American history. And you need to understand slavery in American history to understand our present, because it touches on so many things we wouldn't even think about today. For example, does anybody know what the filibuster is? Or at least heard of the word filibuster? Nobody's taken Government 2305 yet, huh? So the filibusters is a rule in the Senate where you have to have at least 60 votes to bring anything to a vote in the Senate. So in other words, if you have a piece of legislation you're considering that doesn't have, you can't get 60 votes for it, you're not even going to bother bringing it to the floor. The filibuster is a tactic that has been used a lot in the Senate, and it actually has its origins during early American history for the southern states to exert more power and to protect the institution of slavery. So if you Google filibuster and slavery, you'll find a lot of op-ed pieces today arguing that because it is a legacy of the time period of slavery, we might consider removing it. The other reason you might want to remove it is because it makes it very difficult, right, for the Senate to vote on anything, because trying to get 60 politicians out of 100 to agree on things, it's very difficult. So let's rewind and let's talk about why slavery in the United States develops the way it does and why American slavery is different than slavery we see in other time periods in history. All right, so the first question we should probably ask is, why did the United States, number one, embrace slavery in the first place? Number two, why did they decide to enslave Africans? So if we're looking at the need for labor in the colony, for people to do work, it's not a foregone conclusion that we're going to jump to enslaving people. There is a decent amount of conversation over how we're going to get workers. And as you guys wrote about for your short essay, right, what was the solution that many people first tried to turn to? Remember, you just turned in your short essay. I'm working on grading them right now. What was it about? What type of worker?
It was an indentured servant.
Indentured servant, right. So an indentured servant, remember, was somebody who indentured or signed themselves to a contract. And that contract, right, as you guys wrote about, was somewhere between 5 to 7 years usually. And the terms of the contract were the person signed the contract, they got their passage, right, to the United States, or what will become the United States, the colonies. They would be provided food and shelter. And then at the end of their contract, they get freedom dues, right? So their employer or the master who held their contract would have to give them something. So basically, they didn't get their pay until the end. And the idea was that freedom dues could be things like a chunk of land or tools or money, right? And it was stipulated in the contract what the person would get. So indentured servants is the first kind of idea that a lot of the colonists turn to for labor because they just don't have enough people. And that's their way to recruit people, right? With the promise, we'll pay your ticket over here, we'll give you, payment at the end of your contract. Land becomes kind of the most popular option to pay your servants with because that tends to draw more people in. So colonies like Pennsylvania actually have a lot of success getting indentured servants because they're offering land. And that works really well, especially if the survival rate in your colony is low. Because if you recruit an indentured servant and they die before their term is up, you don't have to pay that end payment, right? The freedom dues. Some colonists do use slaves, as you guys saw with your sources and history assignment last week, right? Tituba was a Native American slave. Some colonists do use slaves, but slaves are considered property. So you have to purchase them in the front end. You never have to pay them, right? So there's no freedom dues, right? They're permanently enslaved. And you do have to pay for their upkeep. Okay, but there are different rules. As we're going to see today, the American legal system eventually will evolve to consider slavery a permanent condition and that slaves are considered property and not people. Whereas with an indentured servant is still considered a person, even though they have limited freedom during their contract. They could do things like sue for mistreatment, okay, if their masters abuse them. So slaves don't make a whole lot of sense early on in colonial history because if people are dying, like we saw with Virginia, right? People are dying at a rapid rate. That makes no sense to pay all this money to invest in a slave and then have them die, right? Because then you lose your investment relatively quickly. So as long as the death toll in the colonies is pretty high, it's going to be more cost effective for colonists to use indentured servants because they're temporary workers. They don't really have to invest very much in them until the end of their contracts. It's going to be once the population numbers start to stabilize that it becomes maybe more cost effective to turn to slaves rather than indentured servants. Notice we haven't talked about the option of simply just paying people, right? Wages, like pay them by the hour like we do today. Part of that is it's kind of difficult to attract workers who are going to stick around early on in colonial history. So wage labor is going to become more predominant once we get towards the American Revolution. But for right now in the early colonial period, paying somebody by the hour or a salary every year is really not going to be widely used yet. All right, so if colonists increasingly turn to slave labor, why use Africans and not indigenous or native slaves? Any ideas? Why would you not use Native Americans as slaves? Anybody have any ideas what might the disadvantages be?
Could it be that another tribe would have came and tried to like liberate them?
Yes, so both Eileen and Elizabeth are saying in chat and vocally, right, the idea of backlash. from Native American tribes? Absolutely. So there's that threat, right, to the delicate balance the colonists have between them and Native Americans. So there's a threat of violence. There's a threat that they'll come and try to free them. Or if your native slave runs away, right, that it'll be very difficult to find them. They know the land, the lay of the territory, although slaves like Tituba would actually have been imported from the Caribbean. So they're still native, but they're not in their region that they were born in. They were transported. A lot of colonists actually sold Native Americans into slavery, especially in the Carolinas, but often those that were sold into slavery were shipped other places. They weren't enslaved where they were from, particularly for that reason that you guys mentioned, right? That there were things that would have conflict with local Native Americans, right? If you enslaved some of their people. There's also the issue of European disease, right? The fact that we talked a lot about Native Americans being more susceptible to severe and deadly cases of European disease. Africans do not have that because Africa was in contact with Europe and Asia. They weren't isolated. So Africans tend to have immunity to a lot of these European diseases that are killing off Native Americans. There's also the fact that for Africans who are imported, many of them have skills that are seen as desirable by these American colonists. For example, in the Carolinas, where they established these huge rice growing plantations, Native Americans don't cultivate rice the same way that these colonists were doing it, but Africans were more familiar with rice cultivation as the colonists were doing it, so they would specifically import Africans from rice growing regions in Africa because they already knew how to do this. So there are a couple of different reasons why eventually the colonists turned to African slaves over indigenous ones. And because of African slaves being preferred, what we have happen is we have this notion of race created. Race is what we call a social construction. So in other words, we create categories of race. It's not based on anything scientific, right? There's no difference in DNA between a white person or an African person or a Hispanic person. These are labels that we create based on things like skin color, right? Or like phenotype, like nose shape or hair texture, but they really don't mean anything scientifically. The English colonists hardened this notion of blackness and whiteness because of the institution of slavery. So even though these early colonists are enslaving Africans, it's not based on their race initially. Again, it's based off of skill set and supply. But because slaves were Africans, this creates this notion of difference, of racial difference, and that's where we get the birth of racism. Okay, so this like thought that Africans were in general uncivilized compared to Europeans is going to kind of map onto this notion of whiteness as being sort of more desirable than non-whiteness in U.S. history. So we're going to see this kind of definition of race. This is also where we're going to see the United States, unlike we saw in the Spanish colonies, the United States is going to adopt what we call the one-drop rule, which is if you have any degree of African ancestry, you're African. Even if you look like me, whiter than white bread, if I have any ancestors of African ancestry, then I would be considered black, no matter how pale I am. I do not. I am literally whiter than white bread. I'm like 99% European, according to DNA testing. All right, so let's talk about why African slaves were so available to English colonists in North America. Part of this was because slavery has been a long tradition in world history. Within Africa, slavery was traditionally practiced by groups of people where the enslaved were either enslaved to pay off debts, personal debts they had, or they were captured in warfare and were sort of prisoners of war and enslaved. And slavery in that context in Africa traditionally was not permanent. You could expect to be freed before the end of your lifetime. Many cultures actually, when you were freed as an enslaved person, you were adopted into your former master's extended family unit. If you had kids while you were enslaved, they were not enslaved. So it's a far more temporary condition traditionally in history. And because land in Africa for many cultures was communally owned, so we don't have private ownership of land, your social status is oftentimes determined by things like how many slaves you have. Now, when Europeans started making more trade contacts with Africa in the age of exploration, they saw this system of labor and they decided to exploit it by purchasing slaves from Africans who had captured them and then shipping them to various parts. Initially, they're shipped to places like Portugal because the Portuguese were early slave traders because of a lack of labor. Europe had experienced the Black Death, which was a pandemic of bubonic plague, which killed in some places over half of the population. So Europe had a severe labor shortage going on, and so slaves made sense for them. But once the Europeans start colonizing America and they start growing these cash crop plantations, growing things like sugar and coffee and tobacco, those are all, and rice, those are all very labor intensive. And so we start to see them ship Africans over to these new colonies as well. So this is going to be the triangular trade route. So roughly, this is an oversimplification, but roughly we call this the triangular trade because Europeans would take finished products, things like guns or cloth, down to Africa, trade those for Africans, ship those Africans across the Atlantic, where they would be sold into slavery in the American colonies in exchange for raw materials, things like sugar and rum and tobacco. And then those products, those raw materials, would be shipped back to Europe for consumption. Okay, so that's what we call the triangular trade. It's a little bit of a wonky triangle, but it's still a triangle. So the part here in the middle of the trade, the shipment from Africa to the Americas, is the part that we call the Middle Passage. Okay, this is by far the most horrific portion of this triangular trade. Enslaved people could fetch quite high prices on the market in the Americas. Oftentimes, Africans were sold in the Americas for 2 to 3 times the amount that slave traders initially paid for them. So it's very profitable. Okay? And in fact, the demand for slave labor in the Americas actually destabilizes African population and politics because tribes start to go to war with one another more frequently for the purpose of capturing people to sell into slavery to the Europeans. So the Middle Passage was the traumatic experience that these captured people faced being shipped into slavery in the Americas. Not only were they captured, separated from friends and family, oftentimes they were then marched to the coast. They were held in waiting areas to be sold. And then once they were sold, they were loaded on to these ships to cross the Atlantic. These are some diagrams of what slave ships would have looked like. If you look at that left-hand image, all of those hash marks are people. Okay, these are the Africans that were being shipped into slavery. So conditions in the cargo holds were very horrific. You're actually reading for your sources in history this week an account of by a former slave, Olaudah Equiano. He experienced this Middle Passage when he was about 9 years old. He was captured and sold into slavery. So your sources in history assignment for this week is an account of what it was like to go through this Middle Passage to the Americas. The conditions that Africans endured in these slave ship cargo holds were horrific. In most cases, they did not have enough room to be able to even sit up. The clearance space oftentimes was like this when they were laying down. Many times they did not have any space to do things like get up and go to the bathroom. The food that they got was very minimal. And part of the reason that slave traders packed so many people into so small a space was they knew that even if they lost a number of slaves to death, okay, by disease or starvation or overcrowding, they could still make a tidy profit. Slave traders oftentimes forced these Africans to eat. If they tried to go on hunger strike, they would throw sick people overboard so they wouldn't spread the sickness to others. The journey across the Atlantic at this point in time in the 1700s and 1600s took about 6 weeks. So imagine being crammed into these conditions for 6 weeks. If you want a good visual representation of what this looks like, the movie Amistad is probably the best example of what the Middle Passage would have looked like. Although Amistad is based on a true story of slave rebellion on board a ship in the 1800s, so conditions would have been better than the time period we're talking about now. Part of the reason that conditions improved was during this early couple of centuries of the slave trade, up to 50% of Africans would die on board the ship before they ever got to the Americas. So this eventually prompted slave traders to improve conditions somewhat on board, and that dropped the mortality rate down to 5%. But overall, during the history of the transatlantic slave trade, about 25% of Africans who had been captured never made it to the Americas. They died en route. So this is a visual representation of what the transatlantic slave trade looks like. As you can see, the vast majority of people being captured are coming from West Africa. Although, as you can see, there's also some smaller arrows over here to the right of the map coming from East Africa and Madagascar. But the vast majority of people being captured and enslaved are coming from West Africa. Where, according to this map, are most of these captured people going?
Most of them are going to South America.
Right.
It looks like.
Yes, most of them are going to South America, particularly places like Brazil. Part of the reason for this is sugar plantations. They're very harsh conditions. They take a lot of labor. And the other reason is that the preferred slaves for a lot of these cash crop plantations were young men. So they tend to die off, right, due to overwork and exertion. And so they constantly have to replenish their supply of labor. Whereas the ones that are going to North America are smaller, but the gender balance tends to be better. So in other words, they're not disproportionately importing men, they're also importing women as well. And then the population is going to remain relatively stable because those enslaved people are having kids who become slaves themselves because of how the system evolves. So the slavery that we're talking about and when today is the United States, do remember we don't get nearly as much of the volume, but again, the population remains more stable over time because we don't have this gender imbalance. So the impact of the transatlantic slave trade, you can see by looking in the growth in the thousands per year being transported. Historians estimate about 16 million people initially captured into slavery in Africa to be sold to the transatlantic slave trade between the year 1450, when the first Portuguese took possession of them, to 1850, when the transatlantic slave trade was suspended by many nations. Again, about 12 million of those Africans captured would have actually survived transit to the Americas. So what we see here is that before we get to the 1700s. So remember, 18th century means the year 1700 to 1799. Before we get there, you can see the demand for slaves is relatively low. But after we hit the year 1700, the demand for slaves is going to shoot up. So by the time we get to the 1780s in particular, in some years, over 100,000 slaves are being transported across the Atlantic each year. Okay. So the demand for slaves is increasing after 1700, not just in the colonies that we're talking about, but overall in the Americas. As I mentioned, slavery as practiced in the Americas is very different from the African model of slavery. We're going to see slavery become more permanent. We're going to see slavery become a condition passed on to your children. And we're also going to see slavery being something increasingly defined by race. And in other words, Africans were the ones who were enslaved, not white people, not Native Americans oftentimes become kind of subsumed in this trade. Either they don't live as long or they're intermarrying with and reproducing with Africans. So for the most part, we're going to see this association of African heritage in the Americas with being enslaved. Now, why does slavery get more popular after 1700? Well, let's first talk about when slavery first arrives to the English colonies, what would eventually become the original 13 states of the United States. Initially, Africans who are being brought to the English colonies look more like extended indentured servants. Initially, they're not seen as being permanently enslaved. Okay. The first shipment of Africans sent to be laborers to the English colonies is recorded in 1619 in Virginia, which is where the 1619 Project got its name. Okay, that's the first recorded cargo of Africans to the English colonies. Eventually, what ends up happening is, unlike their white counterparts, these early Africans, who again were indentured servants just for longer contracts, eventually become permanently enslaved rather than just temporarily unfree in an indentured contract. We start to see more and more legal restrictions placed on Africans in the English colonies. For example, as of the 1620s, they were no longer allowed to serve in militias. Many English colonies passed laws that punished not only premarital sex, which is seen as a no-no, having sex before marriage, but also specifically punished relationships between English and Africans. Okay, they did not want English colonists to mix with Africans. They passed a poll tax, so even these free Africans would have to pay a tax to be able to vote and engage in other activities. But Africans at this time were not universally enslaved yet. There were still free Africans. They could still do things like sue and testify in court. They could purchase their freedom. They could even themselves have slaves and indentured servants. Okay, so it's not until the 1660s that we start to see the definitions tighten. The first mention of the word slavery in legal codes in what becomes the United States is in 1662. Okay. Virginia passes a law that says that any child born to a marriage between a slave and a free person has the status of the mother. So in other words, if the mother was the slave, her child was going to be a slave. If the mother was a free woman, the child would be free, even though their father was enslaved. Okay? So this is where slavery becomes an inherited condition, starting in 1662. In 1667, Virginia passes a law that says that claiming to be Christian is not enough to be freed. So prior to this, slaves had basically said, well, it's against the terms of Christianity to enslave fellow Christians, therefore I should be free. Virginia says, no, you can't claim that anymore. Any child born to an interracial relationship a white parent and a black parent, were considered illegitimate because it was not possible legally for people to marry outside of their race. You as a white person could not marry a black person, for example. Okay. And that's where we first get the notion of the one drop rule, that if any part of your heritage is African, you're considered black in the United States legal system. All right, so starting in the 1660s, we're starting to see hardened rules, right? We're starting to see separation between English or white and African or black, okay? What really is the tipping point is going to be Bacon's Rebellion. I know this sounds like a bad case of food poisoning, but it is not. Bacon's Rebellion is a rebellion led by a disgruntled but wealthy planter and unhappy indentured servants, poor white people, and African slaves. So Bacon's Rebellion happens because of increasingly poor conditions for indentured servants and poor whites in Virginia. Virginia was not one of the states that required, or not one of the colonies, that required that you pay your indentured servants in land. And in fact, the headright system, which you guys read about in your textbook, which promises people a chunk of land for every person they bring over. So like your kids, your wife, servants, right? You got land for each of them that went to you. The headright system meant that a lot of land was concentrated in the hand of a few wealthy planters. And because indentured servants were not required to get land at the end of their contract, oftentimes they were given tools and some money, it wasn't enough for these former indentured servants to be able to buy land of their own and get their own start. So poverty levels among white people in Virginia were rising and starting to match that of poverty levels back home in England. The right to vote was restricted only to landowners starting in 1670. And Governor William Berkeley, who was the governor of the Virginia colony, very clearly had his favorites among the wealthy elite and passed policies that further benefited elite landowners. Nathaniel Bacon, as I mentioned, was a wealthy planter himself, but he was not one of Berkeley's clique. He felt that Berkeley was screwing over not only some wealthy landowners like himself, which weren't in Berkeley's inner circle, but also poor people, servants, slaves. So Bacon rallies all of those people to rise up in rebellion against the colonial government of Virginia, and he promised them land and freedom. Okay. So Bacon and his supporters temporarily drive Governor Berkeley and the colonial government out of Virginia. They campaign not only against the Virginia government, but also Native Americans because they want more land. And eventually, after they burn down Jamestown, the English send in the Navy to restore order. Bacon actually died of disease during the rebellion. And the people who were considered otherwise to be ringleaders of the rebellion were rounded up and executed. Okay, so they were not successful. However, the fact that poor white people and poor black people were banding together to try to overthrow the government scared the bejesus out of wealthy white people. So they started making some changes. Virginia started reducing taxes. They pushed more Native Americans off of land, so there were more land available to settlers. And they also started to stipulate that you had to give indentured servants land as part of freedom dues. They also wanted to make it so that there wasn't this like growing class of very poor white people by preferring to import Africans who could be permanently enslaved rather than importing more indentured servants. So this is where the balance of Virginia starts to tip over in favor of using slaves rather than indentured servants, because they're afraid that these indentured servants might in the future be disgruntled poor white people. So that's one of the reasons. This desire to prevent poor whites from trying to overthrow the government was one reason why they wanted to minimize indentured servants and instead turn to Africans for their labor needs. As I mentioned, this is also about the time period where the mortality rate or the death rate starts to level out and colonies become more stable in their population, so it now makes more sense to invest in slaves. Virginia introduces a new slave code in 1705, which legally defines slaves as chattel. Okay, so chattel, spelled C-H-A-T-T-E-L, chattel literally means their property. Okay, so this means that they are not considered a person, they are an object. By doing this, this now means that, for example, if you murder someone else's slave, you would not be tried for murder in the court of law, you'd be tried for property damage. And if you killed your own slave, no legal repercussions because they were literally your property to do with how you wanted. Okay, so under this, Africans who are enslaved are not considered to be people, they are property. At the time Virginia passed this, only about 10% of Virginia's population is enslaved. By the time we get to 1750, half of Virginia's population is going to be enslaved. Okay, so slavery grows. There's still free Africans who exist in Virginia, but laws are passed to restrict them too. For example, they can't hire a white person. They can't strike a white person. They could also, if you were white, you could demand papers from any black person that, you know, they had to prove that they were free, right? Not a slave. So the system starts to become more harsh, the slave population grows. Now the experience of being enslaved depends on where you live. So in the Chesapeake region, in Virginia and Maryland, most slaves are working on large plantations growing tobacco. If you were a slave on one of these plantations, you are primarily working in the fields, tending to tobacco. Tobacco is a very labor-intensive crop. Okay. Freedom in Virginia is increasingly associated with being white. So not African, not any African ancestry, because this system of slavery explodes and because increasingly the vast majority of Africans in Virginia are enslaved. So this is part of the reason why freedom comes to be associated with whiteness in Virginia. And these planters who owned slaves were at the very, very top of the social hierarchy. Virginia also cracks down on the ability of the few remaining free Africans to vote. And it stipulates that if any enslaved African becomes free, that they had to immediately leave the colony. Okay, so Virginia is trying to crack down on this and make it so that you have just a free white population or an enslaved black population, that there's nothing in between. Farther south in Georgia and the Carolinas, they're not growing tobacco so much as they're growing rice and indigo. Like tobacco, rice and indigo is very labor intensive. So most slaves are still doing things like field labor. The English learn how to grow rice from Africans. As I mentioned earlier today, the English are specifically, in this case, for the most part, when slaves are being sold, when Africans are being sold into slavery, the people buying them are not picky about where they come from, except for the case of rice plantation owners, where they are looking for people from specific rice growing regions in Africa to buy, okay, because they already have skills. Plantations, especially rice plantations, have to be very large to be efficient in profit making. Okay. Now, unlike Virginia, where most of these enslaved people are working in fields under the supervision of an overseer or a white overseer, in the Carolinas and Georgia, enslaved people are given a little bit more autonomy. They work under what's known as the task system. So in other words, they're given a series of things that they have to do that day. And once they're done with it, the rest of the day is theirs to do as they wish. So they're not as closely supervised and micromanaged as their counterparts in the Virginias. Okay. So what this means is that slaves in the Carolinas tended to have a little bit more free time. They could do things like grow their own gardens or go hunting, maybe work some side jobs. Okay, so there's a little bit more freedom there. South Carolina, it's at this time that South Carolina's majority population starts to tip over into slave population. By the time of the American Revolution, about 60% of South Carolina's population will be African slaves. Georgia is founded, it's one of the last colonies founded of the English colonies in 1733. And initially, the colony of Georgia, which is a proprietary colony, initially bans slavery. The idea of James Oglethorpe, who the colony belongs to, is that Georgia is going to be a place for Englishmen to get a free start, particularly people who had served prison time for debt. However, the colonists who settled Georgia did not like not being allowed to enslave people and not being allowed to have booze, because that was the other thing he banned. And so by 1751, Georgia becomes a royal colony, and one of the first things that happens after that is to allow slavery. So Georgia then becomes basically a miniature version of North and South Carolina. Now, there are far fewer slaves going to the northern colonies. Part of this is because the population is very different. Remember, we talked about the southern colonies having these large plantations where they're growing cash crops. But remember, when we looked at areas like New England, for the most part, they're small family farms. They don't really have a whole lot of need for slave labor, okay, because they have lots of kids to be able to do work around the farm. So most Africans who were enslaved in the North are doing a variety of tasks. They might work as servants in a household. They might work as assistants to craftsmen. And it was very unusual for even the wealthiest families in the North to have more than one slave, because there just wasn't that much for them to do. Laws regarding slaves were also much more relaxed in the North than in the South. Slave marriages were recognized legally. There were some rules as to things you could not do to your slave, like abuse. So if you were an enslaved person in the North, like you could actually sue your master for mistreatment. They did allow enslaved people the right to pass things down to their children, so inheritance. And as we start to see the growth of population in the North, and particularly the growth of cities, it becomes more cost effective for people in the North to just pay somebody by the hour, pay them a wage, than to own a person, right? Because then if you're paying somebody a wage, you're only having to pay them by the hour for the amount they work. You don't have to put a roof over their head or feed them. It's easy to fire somebody and hire somebody else if they're not doing a great job, right? You have much more flexibility and low overhead. So this is part of the other reason why slavery is less common in the North. It's just not as needed. Doesn't make as much financial sense. Africans are being taken from all of these different regions, mostly, as I mentioned, in West Africa, and they're being brought over. And again, with the exception of South Carolina rice plantations, for the most part, the English colonists do not care where in Africa the person comes from. So what ends up happening is you have Africans from all of these different tribes who speak different languages, who practice different religion and culture, being tossed in together and having to create now this new hybrid culture. So this huge population of people of African descent outside of Africa is an example of what we call a diaspora. Okay? So diaspora is a population of people living outside of their homeland, their original homeland. Okay? So because, again, with the exception of rice plantations, all of these people living on plantations are coming from different areas of Africa. English becomes the dominant language because, again, they don't all speak the same language going in here. We do have some Creole languages or some kind of language mixes going on. For example, in Georgia and South Carolina, we have an example of a dialect known as Gullah for South Carolina or Geechee in Georgia, which is a combination of English and different African words and phrases. But for the most part, English kind of becomes the common dominant language. We also start to see slaves increasingly embrace Christianity, partly because the masters encouraged them to. Some Africans who came over were already Christian. Some practiced indigenous religion, okay, so religion native to Africa. And then others were Muslim, because Islam was very widespread in Western Africa. So as they get over here, many of them were encouraged to embrace Christianity by their masters, but a lot of them blended Christianity with other religious traditions. In some cases, this means that they might identify Christian saints with African gods. They might incorporate African religious rituals like drumming into Christian services. In some cases, this leads to whole new religious mixes. For example, voodoo in Haiti, Santeria in Cuba, and Candomblé in Brazil is a mix of different religious traditions, Christianity, African, Islam, to form this kind of new blend of religion. We also start to see interesting music and food cultures come out of this blending of African traditions with Native American and European traditions. Music is something that definitely we owe a great deal of debt to these enslaved Africans for the music that we enjoy today. Most of the music genres that are popular today have their roots in the African diaspora, whether we're talking about like obvious roots like hip hop, R&B, rap, or if we're even talking about things like country music, blues, gospel, reggaeton. All of those genres have their roots in African musical traditions and instruments brought over and adapted from Africa. For example, banjo, which is very popular in blues and bluegrass, is originally an African instrument brought over because of the slave trade. In terms of food culture, you can kind of see all kinds of different examples of mixing here. Gumbo, if anybody's ever eaten gumbo, I know it's more popular in places like Louisiana and East Texas, is literally a combination of all of these different cultures on a plate. So you have okra, which is originally an African vegetable brought over with captured Africans, European style sauteed vegetables, shellfish from the Americas. There's a bunch of different ideas being brought into here. And in a delicious mix. We also start to see Africans adapting their surroundings to reflect more traditional African traditions, like, for example, African pottery, woven grass baskets, the way that they construct their dwellings. So we have the creation of a truly sort of blended culture, blending different African cultural traditions with European traditions and Native American traditions to make this very unique whole. And again, not only American music culture, but also, I would argue, a great deal of American food culture really owes a debt to African Americans brought over by this slave trade. So we're going to revisit slavery periodically throughout the semester, but this is kind of your introduction to what the foundation of slavery looks like in the 1700s. Y'all have any questions?
No, ma'am.
Now, I have a question for y'all. Is any of this new to you? If you've learned something new today, raise your hand. A couple of people, bits and pieces, yeah. The reason I ask this is because oftentimes slavery is a bit of a touchy subject to cover in K through 12, right? How do you do it in an age-appropriate manner, talk about slavery? Sometimes people just kind of avoid it because it is a touchy subject. So I'm always a bit surprised at what students come in knowing or not knowing about the institution of slavery. Unfortunately, we ran out of time. I wanted to talk a little bit about enslaved people who decided to take matters into their own hands and escape, but we don't have enough time to cover that in really good detail. But your textbook does talk about what happens when Africans do try to resist, right? What we call this in history agency. Agency means power. So the choices that you make, you have power over. So for an African to choose to escape, that's a very risky decision, right? To run away. But at the same time, it's still a decision to decide not to run away, right? That's a choice that you're making. So that's an example of what we call agency. Some Africans, rather than choose to run away, which again was highly risky and very difficult to do during this time period, would choose to resist in other ways, like maybe take their sweet old time doing a job, or maybe break their tools, or do something else to kind of resist and push back. So I do kind of want to emphasize that when we're talking about enslaved people, while they don't have a whole lot of power and control over their situation, they do have some, right? They do have the ability to push back. The ways in which they do so depends upon the level of risk that they're comfortable with. But that's definitely something that we're going to see as we get further into the course. Once we get past the year 1800, we'll kind of revisit that topic again. And we're going to be talking about the second Middle Passage in the United States that happens after 1800. How did I raise my own hand? Who knows? All right, anybody have any last questions before we stop?
For the next Wednesday session, are we going to continue on this topic, or are we going to change on to something else?
We're going to change on to a different topic. What I try to do each week is to to track onto the reading. So next week, I believe your class, we're talking about the beginnings of, are we talking about the beginnings in the American Revolution next week? Let me double check our schedule. Hang on, I have it in Teams. That is an excellent question, and I should know the answer, but my brain is a little fried this morning. All right, let's see. We have, Origins of the American Revolution is next week. We will revisit the topic of slavery later in the semester, but for right now, this is where we're going to leave it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank y'all. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. If you have any other questions,